We're very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning, Sherry Wolf. Sherry Wolf is a leading member of the International Socialist Organization, a National Equality March speaker and steering committee member, and associate editor of the International Socialist Review. She has written for Alternate, ZNet, Counterpunch, Monthly Review, Dissident Voice, New Politics, Socialist Worker, and many other progressive publications and websites, as well as interviews on Democracy Now!, Pacifica Radio, and in Business Week. And she is author of the new book, Sexuality and Socialism, History, Politics, and Theory of LGBT Liberation. I want to get to your book as well, but we've been having, we just had a major local elections across the U.S., and I think there's been a lot of significant developments there. And I wanted to get your take on the critical votes, including what happened in Maine.
Sure. Obviously, things like Referendum 71, the sort of everything but marriage passing here in Washington State, stands in contrast to what was known as Question 1 in Maine, where equal marriage rights were basically nullified in a popular vote. It's the 31st time in a row that that equal marriage rights were voted down in a popular vote in this country, which means that every single time it's been put to a vote, it's been voted down. I think we can draw the conclusion that some are drawing, that we live in some sort of bastion of reaction, that gay rights will just simply never be embraced by the majority of the population. I frankly choose to take a different point of view. I don't think that's the evidence on offer. I think, first of all, it is unquestionable whether or not what the direction of consciousness is going to in this country. In the major cities, in places, even in states like Maine, in Portland, or on college campuses like the University of Maine, the overwhelming vote, I mean, to the tune of somewhere around 80%, was for equal rights for LGBT people, for equal marriage rights. And that is where consciousness is moving to in this country. But these ballot initiatives are absolutely a disastrous strategy for progressives. It plays to the hands and plays to the strengths of the right, regardless of the amounts of money they have, because obviously where our strength is when we are in collectives, in urban areas, in college campuses, and workplaces, and where we are weakest is when we are individuals. Areas in smaller towns, and even here in the state of Washington, the vote was overwhelmingly pro-equal marriage in the major cities, and in the eastern, more rural parts of the state, that's where the vote. And so I think, it's all the more reason why I got involved with the National Equality March 11th that drew out about 250,000 people 3 weeks ago, because we basically said enough to list state by state, issue by issue strategy for LGBT equality. If we are equal human, we want full federal equality now. We want to be added finally to the Civil Rights Act of 1960 and assume our position as full equal human beings with the rest of the American population. And so I really think that consciousness in this country, by all indicators, is actually moving in the direction of equality, certainly among the youngest generation, but even among older people in this country who overwhelmingly are for equal employment rights for LGBT people, more than 90% in poll after poll, and on and on and on down the list of issues. And really what is backward is our federal laws and our state laws. It's the U.S. government that actually stands behind the majority of the American population on these questions at this moment.
Did R71 get any national coverage? Because I didn't see it at least mentioned on the corporate news.
It got mentions, but I think probably because the nature of it being the sort of everything but marriage, a sort of domestic partnership, and I think there was, at least nationally, a perspective that it was going to pass easily, although statewide I understand the squeaker that it was truly expected. So it got minimal coverage in, the New York Times, or mentions on Rachel Maddow or Anderson Cooper, but I think it didn't have quite the cachet of Maine because you basically had, what was at that moment the 6th state to have equal marriage rights that was then once again putting it to a vote as a result of a right-wing initiative to basically do what California did. It was sort of known as the mini Prop 8. It reversed rights that had already been granted by the legislature. And I just think it's a dog of a strategy. It needs to be jettisoned.
And then the National Equality March, was that something that was unique to now having the Obama administration in power, something that wouldn't have been appropriate during the Bush administration?
I think, to me, I'm a socialist. I think protest is always appropriate. If people don't speak to power that way, then you have no other way of confronting them effectively. I think that this was the first march, teabagging bigots aside, this was the first march against the Obama administration, or to challenge, I should say, the Obama administration to basically carry out the policies and the promises that it has made, which it still has not. In fact, I believe that they played an absolutely disastrous role in Maine, where the Obama administration purposefully, at best, was passive and said nothing, and at worst was somewhat hostile. It actually said, we believe that this should be decided by the states. It's somewhat astounding to me that a black man would get up and argue what is essentially, an argument of the old Confederacy about states' rights. We don't put people's civil rights to votes in this country. We haven't historically. I don't know why LGBT people are supposed to accept this strategy. Nobody ever would have argued 45 years ago that we should leave it to the loving arms of the Mississippi legislature to decide what happens with Jim Crow. Even 1 year after miscegenation laws were struck down by the Supreme Court in 1967 in this country, only 20% of the American population agreed with black and white marriage. Should we have put this to a vote? Of course not. You don't put people's civil rights, you don't put human rights to a vote. We cannot wait for reactionaries to catch up. We have to push forward as a society for full civil equality. So that's number one. I forgot where we started that, but that's the road I went down. So the march basically was flipping the script. We basically said the dominant establishment organizations, groups like Human Rights Campaign and others, the federal, the equality federations of the country do some very good work. I have nothing against the individuals involved on the ground, but to be honest, they operate like corporations and they are beholden to the Democratic Party. They have millions of dollars and they spend that on lobbying and black tie dinners, best as I can tell. They are not grassroots. They are not activist-oriented. And, in terms of from the national folks aren't. And we said this is enough. We want a grassroots activist strategy. And so that's what the march expressed. And what we're hoping to do out of the National Equality March now is form a network of these groupings and elect a leadership, a strategy, and a structure to form something called Equality Across America, to form an alternative, more left-wing, more activist network of LGBT folks and allies who want to fight for full equality now.
Well, I'm hoping you can give us some more history on how we got to where we are today. Your new book, Sexuality and Socialism, History, Politics, and the Theory of LGBT Liberation, talks about the history here, both in the U.S. and worldwide. Can you kind of give us a brief synopsis?
Sure, absolutely. And by the way, I'm in town in Seattle to speak at the Crisis and Resistance Northwest Socialist Conference. I'll be speaking this evening at 7 p.m. in Thompson Hall at the University of Washington, and then again tomorrow at greater length about sexuality and socialism at 10:30 a.m. at that same hall. I wrote the book, Sexuality and Socialism, because no book-length sort of history, politics, and theoretical discussion existed from an unabashed socialist point of view. There are brilliant histories out there. George Chauncey, John D'Amelio, Lillian Faderman, Susan Stryker. There are brilliant histories that exist, to take absolutely nothing away from them. But there did not exist an analysis of how what are the roots of LGBT oppression? How do we explain this politically and theoretically? Why does it persist into the modern era where you have Will and Grace or a movie like Milk winning an Academy Award? How do we explain that a movement that was born on the streets of Lower Manhattan, at least in its modern incarnation, in a riot, has become so neutered and, going hat in hand to politicians begging for crumbs, and of course has become largely reduced to a market niche by, Miller Beer or Citibank or, this gay pride brought to you by, Absolute Vodka, on and on. So I wanted to delve into these questions as well as take up some of the debates that exist within progressive circles about directions, about politics, about theory, and do it in a way that is accessible. Because one of the things that really has always piqued me is how you can have so much intelligent writing about sexuality be so frigging boring. and so impenetrable. I mean, I don't know how many people have attempted to read through people like Judith Butler or Eve Sedgwick or some of these folks who have some things to say that I would agree with, and some things I have to say I give up, and others I just think it leads you to absolute paralysis politically. And I think that needed to be explained. What are these ideas about anyway? So I take this apart in a much more perhaps fast-paced, somewhat entertaining fashion. We are, after all, talking about sex. Why the hell can't we talk about clitoral orgasms and lesbian porn and all the rest of that? And incorporate that into an understanding of how do progressives not only fight for LGBT liberation, but how do we get to this point where we're at now anyway? So that's some of the stuff that the book goes into, as well as conjecturing about what it would mean to talk about sexual liberation and using some historical examples to sort of flesh out a question that has largely disappeared from our discussion. We now talk about rights, we talk about, pride, we talk about freedoms, but we never talk about liberation. And I think we need to talk about sexual liberation for all. LGBT people may be oppressed, but we're all sort of repressed in the society, it strikes me. And that needs to be fleshed out, discussed, debated, and that's what I try and do as best I can in Sexuality and Socialism.
And you believe that capitalism is the primary problem with that, is that right?
I think you have to look at class society as having a material stake in the ongoing oppression and discrimination against people who are sexual minorities, whether they're transgender folks who have not only the violence levels against trans people just through the roof, but the unemployment, the housing issues, the discrimination in all areas of public accommodation are outrageous. It is, by the way, perfectly legal in 38 states in this country to not be hired or to be fired because of your gender presentation, whether you're trans or not. If you just simply aren't sufficiently butch or as a guy or a femme as a woman, it's perfectly legal not to be hired or to be fired. All of these things, I think, play into a need of a class society to perpetuate gender and sexual roles in order to shore up what is a very convenient system for them, which is called the nuclear family. The nuclear family provides a service for capital. It is an extremely convenient means for social needs like childcare, housework, feeding, cleaning, all these things that are necessary in any modern society to be foisted into the private realm. And to some degree, LGBT people pose a challenge to that conception. So it's not just about crappy ideas that exist out there, reactionary ideology that exists from being spouted from some religious institutions, which is true. They do spout crappy ideas, some of them not. But we have to understand what are the material reasons that class society has such a schizophrenic approach to LGBT folks. On the one hand, using images of, gay people to sell stuff, toothpaste to beer, or, queer eye for the straight guy or whatever it is. And on the other hand, a lack of civil rights and protections that, simply continues to be the law in this country. So that's what I try and take apart. What are both the material and ideological reasons behind LGBT oppression?
So sticking with the concept of the nuclear family, so have other societies not emphasized that and used that as a tool for shaping their society?
Well, of course, we have across the world different language used to describe different societies, but I think as a global system, capitalism dominates. Capitalism is all there is. Whether whether you're talking about Cuba or China or the former Soviet Union, or you're talking about Western Europe or the United States, we are talking about societies that are industrialized societies that operate through competition, where you have, if not on internally, then they compete on the international level. And so capitalism is the only system we have in the world. And what we can see is that there are needs of the dominant class, what Marx would refer to as the ruling class, essentially fancy terms for people who own and control everything, whether it's the factories or mass transit or communication systems, they have material needs. And part of those material and ideological needs is the need to divide ordinary people against each other. Nothing succeeds so well as divide and conquer. And so fomenting lies, fomenting notions of, who is worthy and who is unworthy, what is normal and what is not normal, what is acceptable in our society and what is unacceptable. This is something that capitalism has spread ideologically across the globe. And yet we can see certain moments in time, late 19th century in Germany, in the labor movement, the early 20th century in Russia during the revolution there, the 1960s for that matter in this country, where all sorts of questions from imperialism to racial divides were being thrown into questions, where sexually liberatory ideas came to the fore, and people began to fight for a different kind of sexual and gender order. And that's a history that needs to be not only revived and discussed, but actually theoretically dealt with. Why is it that when people go into struggle against an economic order, they are forced to face questions around sex and gender? And that's why I believe you cannot separate out questions of fights against economic oppression and sexual and gender oppression.
Do you have an answer to that? Why are people forced to deal with the questions of sexuality and...
Well, yeah, I think that because the ideas that we are taught to have about each other, the suspicions that are fomented, actually become fetters when you try and collectively oppose the dominant order. Think about in this country, and I write about in the book, and a brilliant historian by the name of Alan Barabay, who wrote a magnificent book called Coming Out Under Fire about gays in World War II. And the role that World War II played in this country of developing an enormous gay subculture. He was doing some research about the early part of the 20th century, and you can see how even back as early as like 1930, a union of 20,000 Marine Cooks and Stewards Union elected an openly gay black man and had a leadership that had open gays and blacks in it, to a union of 20,000. In fact, the banner that hung over the Union Hall said, "Queer baiting, race baiting, and red baiting equals a union busting." Because in their concrete reality of their day-to-day lives and their organizing against the bosses, they found racism, sexism, homophobia, and frankly, red baiting to be obstacles to any kind of progress. So people confront these sorts of backward ideas in the reality of their own organizing in their lives. And we see it today as well.
So how has LGBT issues and liberation fared under socialist governments?
I think that what we have had are experiments and attempts at socialism, but we have not had socialism anywhere in the world. And I take some time to go through that in the book, because the most advanced moment when workers actually did take power in a mass uprising was in 1917 in Russia, of course. And one of the first things they did was they got rid of the criminal code, including the laws against homosexuality, and it's where the first recorded sex change operations take place. You have the legality of same-sex marriage in the early Soviet Union. You had women fighting alongside of men in the Red Army, all of these kinds of things. And in fact, many, many debates about sexuality, about transgenderism, and all of these things were thrown into question. But of course, this is an immensely backward society. 80+% were peasants. And the gains of that revolution were crushed. So by the late 1920s, the early 1930s, you would basically, under Stalin, have a return to this sort of same kind of reactionary, divisive ideas and ideology that dominates in capitalist countries the world over. And by 1934, you have a recriminalization of homosexuality. And in fact, to just sort of, icing on the cake, women begin to get medals for having children. What could be more, sort of embracing of sort of capitalist gender and societal norms than things like that. So these are not signs that socialism betrayed LGBT people, but actually that these societies betrayed socialism and certainly had reversed whatever gains. And I think, in Cuba you have, a different kind of a setup. But here you have a popular guerrilla uprising against an imperial, puppet state that was essentially a colony of U.S. imperialism in 1959. But you did not have a mass workers' uprising take control. What you have is a popular uprising in which the state, the state actually for the first time imposed anti-gay laws in Cuba when Fidel Castro came to power. And so you had a massive reaction against gays. And there's all sorts of social reasons for that. The fact that Cuba had been turned into a brothel effectively by wealthy Americans. It was seen as somehow a way of their anti-gay policies were seen as somehow a slap to the American empire. We're no longer going to allow these wealthy, people to come here and have their way with their citizens. But of course, its impact was devastating to the gay population inside Cuba. Now, all of that is long past. There are many, many progressive reforms that have happened inside of Cuba in the decades since. There's absolutely undoubtable. But just as you cannot have independent trade union organizing and independent left organizing in Cuba, you do not have independent LGBT organizing outside of the state in Cuba. So again, these are not signs of socialism's betrayal to LGBT people. This is a sign that this society, in fact, is not about workers' power, is not about a genuine democratic liberatory society. These are betrayals of socialism, not betrayals of gays alone.
Are there any societies currently where gays are treated as equals?
Well, actually, there's been vast reforms that have been passed throughout Western European countries, in Canada, and even in many places in this country. I mean, one of the votes that got less notice on Tuesday was in Kalamazoo, Michigan, where an overwhelming majority of the population in that town voted for that people would be protected in their city, regardless of sexual orientation and gender identity. So there are progressive reforms, but nonetheless, so long as we live in a system that needs to divide us against each other, this sort of discriminatory ideology will persist. In the same way that we live in a society where there are civil rights for blacks and brown people and all sorts of people in American society. You can even have a black president. But institutional racism remains the law of this land. You still have discrimination on a widespread basis, whether it's in the criminal justice system or in employment. I mean, unemployment today is now 10.2% among the general American population. For blacks, it is through the roof. It is well over 15% overall, and for young blacks in this country, young African Americans, it is in some places well over 40 or 50%. So we have the formal equality, we have the civil rights reforms, but we still have racism. In the same way that I believe that you can have and must fight for civil rights reforms for LGBT people, that does not mean it will get rid of the ideological and material need of a society for homophobia. It's
interesting that I was listening to one of your talks and didn't realize we hear the term heterosexuals a lot and assume, that goes back forever.
Right.
But as you pointed out, it actually is a fairly recent word, or at least used in the dictionary.
Yeah. No, Webster doesn't define heterosexual until somewhere around 1923. Homosexual is defined back at the turn of the century, and that's actually coined as a term in 1869 by a fellow by the name of Benkert, in a physician in who I believe was I want to say Bulgarian, perhaps he's Hungarian. I'm sorry, I apologize to Eastern Europeans, but it wasn't the norm against which gays arose. People were simply sexual. The idea that people would be identified or think of who they had sex with as a salient feature of their identity is an utterly modern conception, utterly inconceivable conception in the early part of the 19th century. It's really not until the rise of the Industrial Revolution, when human beings can live autonomously from the nuclear family. Let's remember, in this country, it was illegal. It was illegal to live outside of the nuclear family. Even when you went off and apprenticed somewhere, you left your family and you moved to, the big town in Lowell, Massachusetts, and you went and you, whatever, became a tailor or, hammered out something in metal, or you can tell I have no idea what the hell they were doing. But you lived with that family. That was what you had to do. There were no options. You didn't go, get with your gal pal and go take a little pied-à-terre somewhere in town. That wasn't allowed. That wasn't conceivable. So it's only with the creation of people being able to live autonomous lives in the late 19th century in major cities and become anonymous as well. And the mass influx of migration into this country, in particular among European immigrants who came here first alone as single men, who then brought their families, if they did, later on, years later, that you begin to have a subculture develop in this country, in this society, of people who identified themselves by their sex acts. People always had gay sex. Don't get me wrong. From the moment that human beings, slithered out of the primordial ooze, we have been doing all sorts of funky things sexually. But people would not have identified themselves on that basis until the late 19th century. It wouldn't have been conceivable largely for people to have consistently had, sort of a gay lover that they lived with somewhere. That's a very modern reality. And so heterosexuality actually early on just referred to a range of sex acts and a range of sexual practices. People were just simply sexual. And then, even sodomy was not about gay sex early on. Sodomy was simply non-procreative sex, which was made illegal because it posed a challenge to the ability of an industrializing society that needed children to have more children. So anything that didn't produce children was verboten. So sodomy only later on came to mean gay sex. Earlier on, it meant oral sex or all sorts of alternative diddlings. So that's the history of it.
All right. And in addition to your book, Sexuality and Socialism, do you have other resources people can turn to, like website or anything?
Yes. I write a regular column now for socialistworker.org. I have a piece up there just from yesterday on what does Maine tell us. I have many other things I write about, by the way, aside from the LGBT issues. I write about Palestine. I write about imperialism. I write about a range of issues as a socialist, although obviously over the last few months with the rise of a new movement and the march and the book being released, my focus has been more around LGBT stuff, but I often write about a range of social and economic justice issues.
All right. Well, with that, we're unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming and spending time with us this morning.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.